on Indigenous land. The Galiano Community Library honors the continuing work of truth and reconciliation and respectfully acknowledges Coast Salish people upon whose unceded territories we live and work. While we invite participants who are joining us from Galiano Island to consider their specific obligations to the Penelakut, Lamilki, and other Halkamenim-speaking peoples in particular, the reality of the virtual universe in which we're gathered means that many of us may have other lands and obligations to remember and acknowledge, and we encourage you to do so at this time. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today, particularly on such a beautiful May afternoon. We are thrilled to present this wonderful talk today, The Ancestors and Us, Remembering and Honoring Collaboration. Please note that this talk is being recorded and will be posted on the Galiano Library's YouTube channel. If you don't want to appear in this recording, you should shut off your video. All participants will be muted during the talk, other than the speakers. For an optimal experience of the talk, we recommend that you switch to speaker view in your Zoom settings. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the talk. The speakers ask that you type your question directly into the Zoom chat box, and they will address it at an appropriate moment in the talk. I'm delighted to welcome our presenters for today, Rosemary Georgeson, Jessica Hallenbeck, and Dory Nason. Rosemary Georgeson, Coast Salish, Augh-Ta-Naogh, was born and raised on Galiano into a fishing family. Since leaving the fishing industry, she has become an award-winning storyteller, playwright, and filmmaker. Her stories are deeply rooted in her family history on Galiano and her search for her ancestral grandmothers. Jessica Hallenbeck completed her PhD in geography at UBC in 2019. Her dissertation, The Water We Call Home, 5 Generations of Indigenous Women's Persistence Along the Salish Sea, created in close collaboration with Rosemary, received the 2020 Starkey Robinson Award. Jessica is also the co-founder of Lantern Films. Dory Nason, Anishinaabe, PhD, is an enrolled member of the Leech Lake Band of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. At UBC, her areas of research include contemporary Indigenous feminisms and related Native women's intellectual history and literature. She was awarded a prestigious Killam Prize for teaching excellence in 2013. With gratitude for their generous participation, I will now turn the event over to the speakers.
Thank you for that. I am very excited to be a part of this event. I have had the pleasure of working with Jessica as a part of her PhD supervisory committee. And through that, I have come to know Rosemary, and I'm so lucky to call these two women friends, and to have watched this project grow and deepen over the last 10 years. This is not the first time I've moderated a talk for them. I've done it a few times at other venues, but most recently in my classrooms. I love having them come talk about the ethical relationship that they built through their research, and just also to tell this wonderful story. So I'm really, really grateful to kind of been a fly on the wall for many of this, much of their work. And so my first question that I want them to share with you, and that's kind of how I'm gonna moderate, is ask them questions and prompt them along, and then I'll also pay attention to the chat if there's time for questions that come through. But just, I thought it would be good for everyone to know and to get to meet you a little bit through asking the question about how you first met and began this friendship.
You want to start, Jess?
Sure. Yeah, well, first of all, Dory, thank you so much for doing this with us today. You've been so central to supporting this work, and we're really excited to once again kind of be in conversation with you and share our work with Galiano today. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, so I think Rose and I both love telling this story. So we actually met in Williams Lake. I was there working with the city to try to get the city to adopt an equity policy. And I was doing some youth engagement work. So this was kind of in my early 20s. I had just started my own community engagement company and was really excited about using film and using photography as a way to, bring youth together in conversation about some of what their experiences had been in Williams Lake. And that's kind of, I think that's where we first met, but it was only briefly, right, Rose?
Yeah, I think you'd met with Diane previous to that, but that's where we met because I'd been up there working for about 3 or 4 years with a group of youth. And we brought the youth to a discussion that you were having at City Hall in Williams Lake. And that's where we first met. And yeah, that's over a decade ago now.
Yeah.
2010, I believe. Kids are all growing up and gone off to university, and all sorts of things have happened since.
Yeah, and Rose kind of through that work and through that what became a collaboration really between myself and Urban Inc. and Rose. Rose invited me in to create a short film that she was directing called We Have Stories, Women and Fish. And so that really kind of began our collaborative creative work together. And that film was basically, we were kind of finishing work on that film when I started my PhD. Rose, did you want to share anything more about that film?
Yeah, it was very interesting to me because I didn't know much about filmmaking at the time. And some of the things that we talked about doing and what we were filming. And I could see Jess had some interesting looks on her face because I was asking her to film in ways that were different for her. So that was really where we started talking about how we work together and how we create things together, because I was going for a connection that was very normal for how we interacted, say at the end of the day when we came in from fishing. And Jess was looking at what we were doing through the eyes of a filmmaker and how we could bring these stories together and create in that place that was, for me, just a very normal way of doing things, to be sitting in a circle on our boats at the end of the day sharing stories, and how Jess could film this and pull this story together through my Indigenous eyes, I guess. And it was through that piece, through that working together that first time like this, that through Jess, I learned about how documentary filmmaking was first created here in Canada to work against us as Indigenous people. Right away, I was like, oh, we've got to use this. We've got to make documentaries, because it was used primarily to work against us. Yeah, that was our beginning. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, Dory, do you have kind of a follow-up, or should we just keep going?
You can keep going, but I was just for folks who haven't seen We Have Stories, if you could talk a little bit about what the film was about. And this is how I got to know Jessica's and Rosemary's collaboration, because she shared it with our class, with my students. And I was really excited about the story that Rosemary was telling in that particular film. And it really was kind of lead up to this particular story. And also, I think, a turning point, Jessica, in your PhD research. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Rose, do you want to share a little bit about the film, and then I can kind of.
Okay.
Yeah.
When we did Women and Fish on Galliano in 2004, that was the story of women in the commercial fishing industry, but there was so much in that piece that it still needed more space to share such a huge story. That's where We Have Stories came in. It's Connie Crocker, Jane Marston, women that I fished with growing up, their stories of being on the water. Dr. Woodrow Morrison, who is Haida from Metlakatla, Connie Crocker from Penalaket, Jane Marston from Layaxin, Marge White, Nuchalnath Elder, sharing our stories of being on the water and being fishermen and just living the life. Go ahead, Jess.
Well, I could show the trailer now for it. Does
Okay.
that make sense? I think it does. We were going to save it for later, but we're in it now. So I'll just share this. Give me 2 seconds.
It's its own world. When I was a boy, some of the old men I listened to were already 100 years old, some a little older. So I heard the stories when they traveled before the gas boats and what life was like then. And so when we talk about our world, what we have to do is take a look at that world and define ourselves as to how we interact with the land. And so if you'll pay attention to what we're telling you, you can recreate your own world. You don't have to try to live in ours. And so sit back and close your eyes, but open your mind, because there's so much of the world that you can't get from media otherwise. You can get it from listening to voices speaking rather than simply somebody writing a script for you.
We have stories. We've always had them. They've been passed down to us for more generations than we can count. That's how we knew what to do, how to live with the water, how to fish, where the fish were. It gave us everything we needed. We have the stories that have been passed to us. We have our own stories from our time out there.
Okay. Yeah, so when I started my PhD, we were in the process of editing that film. And that's, this is kind of the beginning of really Dory being an incredible support for our work. I met Dory and she, urged me, or she just, I guess, asked a question around why the work with Rosemary was not going to be part of my PhD. I proposed a kind of different topic and a different focus, and I was really hesitant about bringing our friendship and our work into the academy, right? Because the academy can be a very colonial space, or it is a very colonial space, and I was really worried that it would, in a way, wreck what we had. And so, that was sort of, I was very trepidatious about doing that. But that kind of shifted when we were invited again by Dory to present on our work at NISA, the Indigenous Studies Conference that was in Saskatoon. And we drove out there together. And, it was like, I think on these really long drives that we began to more seriously talk about what it would mean to collaborate through the doctoral work that I was doing. Yeah.
Jess is so humble with your research story. So, but so that brings us to you beginning to take the time that you would be putting towards your doctoral research to Rose's research full-time, in a more full-time way. So I think it's a good transition in thinking about So to talk a little bit about, maybe some of that drive, like what were some of the ethical considerations that you were thinking through in terms of how to go about locating the stories of Emma and Sophie? And then maybe transition to when you started to do that research and found, what was it like to find them finally? So I'll leave it at that.
Well, we had 3 days through floods and tornadoes to talk about all of this on our drive there. The work what Jess was proposing in her work at that time, it was an interesting place to go. And then, we talking very in depth about the grandmothers that didn't exist, that were written out of history. And I having that talk with Jess and sharing with her that if there's some of this story that I'm sharing with you that can be used or support your work, I would love to share it with you. At that time I was still feeling a little burnt out from looking for my family, because I'd been down a couple different paths where I was full on lied to by the government and priests, for one, that no family existed still. So it was still kind of like an open wound from that. And but I knew that the story needed to be shared, and the work that Jess was doing at the time for her PhD and such, talking about where she was going to go with that. But this story also fit into what she was looking at too. And that was through that drive was the start of, how this story was going to be shared. I know she was a little nervous because she said she wasn't a researcher at that point, but she did a great job. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is where it's really, again, amazing to have a committee that is really supportive of a different kind of research process, where, the research questions weren't really determined ahead of doing the work in a way. And the research questions really came from Rose. So, like one of the first, we basically sat down together in Rose's kitchen and I asked her, what do you want to know? What do you want to learn? And Rose shared that she wanted to find the traditional names of her grandmothers, Emma and Sophie. And, at the time I thought, okay, that's kind of scary. They were around in 1850. We have really no idea what nations they were from, or so, I said yes, but at the same time, I kind of didn't believe that it would happen, and we kind of, set out and began a series of conversations, really. And that's where it started, was Rose sharing a lot of what she knew and what she remembered. And then I also started to look for funding to be able to support Rosemary. I had a scholarship, and I think it was obviously very important for Rose to also get paid to do this research, and so that kind of is where we started, and that's also part of why it took so long to do the work. Yeah, Rose, do you have anything to add to that?
Thinking back to all the hours of conversation that we had, because every time we thought of something, or a new memory came back, we'd sit and talk about it, sometimes for hours on end, and looking at it and kind of taking it apart and looking at ways that we could research it. And you know, Jess was so awesome because she had the patience for me to share these stories, which sometimes took a lot. And then she had ideas of where we could look too, because I said earlier, I was kind of, you know, by the time I'd gone through the archives and gone down some of these paths, I was pretty exhausted by a lot of it. But Jess was seeing it with new eyes, and it needed new eyes to look at it. It needed new eyes to look at it from different places, not just through what I was seeing and what I was finding in the roadblocks I was coming up against.
Jess, were you going to add to that?
No, it's okay.
Well, I'll ask another question. One of the things that I got to see when I visited Galiano with you two a couple of trips back was, oh gosh, I don't even know how long ago it was. It was quite a while ago. I was struck by, and just Rosemary, you just made the point about being able to tell these stories, but being on Galiano and walking the spaces that your maternal ancestors walked and your family still lives, and just that the memories came much quicker, and being on in the spaces. And then so there's that part of the kind of figuring out what are their names, how do we figure this out, how do we find them, but they were there with you. And then the other spaces that this research took place was the literal archives, like, you know, in Victoria or wherever it is that you visited, and the very different ways that felt in terms of the search that you were doing, and the memories coming through the land and visiting, and then what was being represented on paper. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that kind of dichotomy, or how that felt as you were doing this research.
Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that dichotomy carries through the work together, right? And also is about our different experiences of doing the research and of writing about it. And I think certainly something I was really aware of was, as I think this will be especially ring true on Galiano, is, you know, Rose's family has been written about a lot, and has often been written about by people who are outside of her family. And so we did start by contacting researchers who had done this kind of genealogical work on Rose's family already, and basically asked them for their archival references so that we weren't starting from zero. But yeah, that was something that I think was like an ongoing conversation between us for this work, was yeah, both like the impact of being at the archive and the pain that you know that brings out, and then also what that would look like when we would visit family or visit places. Yeah, Rose, I don't want to say too much.
Yeah, when we went to the archives, Jess was very patient with me, because there was lots of times when she would see that I was getting overwhelmed by it. And that there was an anger that started coming out in me, because as we were going through the archives, we were there for 3 days. There was my grandmothers were gone. They weren't there. But, you know, Scotty was there. He lost a child. He grieved. My grandmothers didn't. There was nothing about them anywhere, except, you know, the names the government gave them, and Indian woman written beside them. One grandmother, she only existed for a few years. and that was through the census. So there was a lot of frustration in it. And, Jess was there beside me, supporting me through all of that loss, um, that whole world of emotions that happened in those few days. But it opened up the door to, to look for them, to need to know it. I think that's where my need to know who they were became so strong. How can you write people out of history like they don't exist? And I'm standing, I'm here in front of all of you. I exist, but they didn't, and I look like them. I have a great aunt who we were the spitting image of each other. She didn't exist, but we could have passed off as twins, so. And the archives didn't fit with the stories that had been passed on. And it was kind of interesting after we left, because Jess was watching for my reactions to some of these things that were brought out in the archives. And I'm like, no, it wasn't like that. That's not the story. Because these stories have been passed down through my father, my grandparents, other old family members. So I knew the discrepancies between the stories. And that's how Jess gauged a lot of things, was through my reaction to them. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that I write about this in the dissertation, is my family, is on my dad's side, they were early Dutch settlers to Haudenosaunee territory. And there's tons of genealogical information on them, right? Going back hundreds of years. And so my own experience of, looking for family and finding them in the archives is a very different experience than Rose's. And it's something that I didn't think about that much ahead of us going there. But it certainly kind of shifted everything in terms of the way that we worked together, and the way that Rose kind of led that research through those the stories, the responses, the memories, the feelings, right? That Rose, that we were kind of going through together in a way.
So I guess this would be a good part in the conversation to tell us what you found, and not just the dissertation project, of course, came to an end, because I got to witness that, but the stories that you and the names, and just what happened.
Rose, do you want me to show a couple of those photos? Is that helpful?
Yes,
you can
please.
do that quickly. Okay. Do you want to share what these are as we're looking, or I can just run through them and then?
This, I can share a bit of this one. You see the markings in there: Galliano, Vancouver, Cocolita, Squamish, Church House, Hamalco Reserve. These are the places where all my grandfather's siblings wound up after they left Galliano. And one place, Squamish, that we later found out that that's where my great grandmother was from. Yeah. one of the first charts of active paths.
Yeah, this is Scotty's preemption. Yeah, that he filed. Sorry, there's one more, but I'm having trouble bringing it up. Give me 2 seconds.
Can you find the one of the archives where we found Sophie?
There we go.
As
This
you
one?
can, yeah, as you can see in this one, the government named my great-great-grandmother. And up until that point, as you can see, she was still just recognized as an Indian woman. They wouldn't marry Scotty and Sophie until Sophie had what they called a proper name. We did find her name because one of my old aunties wrote her real name, her traditional name, on the bottom of her death certificate. Otherwise, it would have been lost to us. That was, go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what's amazing and what isn't completely shared in the dissertation, but will be shared in a forthcoming co-authored book is, you know, the stories that kind of weave through these archives, right? So like Scotty's preemption, knowing that Sophie was there with him, you know, working the land, safeguarding, you know, the land. You know, there's all these pieces that I think if I were just to go to the archive, it's like, it would just be this, you know, very dry and inaccurate kind of list in a way of who did what, where and when. But certainly the kind of yeah, it doesn't open up to like restoring these relationships, restoring these connections. And yeah, anyways, I'll stop.
Well, and I think that was what made this project so rich for me, watching it unfold. On the one hand, you were recovering stories of your family history, Galiana history, Georgeson Bay history. And on the other hand, you were undoing a lot of what that history, how it had been told, who was left out. And of course, as an Indigenous feminist, I was like, great, we're finding the women, we're finding about the women, and we're recapturing a moment that we can think back at what their contributions were and how important they were, not only in this family, but in the territory around fishing and all sorts of different forms of knowledge that they brought. So I thought that was just, you know, it became such a really well-rounded project of telling the stories of Emma and Sophie, finding their traditional names, but finding out so much more, not just about family, but about this particular place. And so I wonder if you could talk about anything that was surprising that you learned in your research journey. And then also, if you, I know you want to perhaps read from an article that you both co-wrote that tells a little bit of the story. And my final thing, and we'll keep all three things in your mind, is that somebody had asked about what a preemption is.
You want to go there, Jess? Explain preemption.
Yeah, sure. So preemption was basically the way that most of the land was stolen and colonized. And that involved a process of filing a land claim, a preemption record, that included information on, you know, what the land was, how you cleared it. The land had to be enclosed and actively kind of farmed over a number of years. The years changed a bit depending on what period of time we're talking about in BC. So that photo I shared was Scotty's preemption claim to the land that then became Georgeson Bay. and the cemetery and that whole area. And, you know, of course, at that time, Indigenous people were filing preemption claims as well. And there was kind of a behind the scenes crisis within the colonial government in terms of how that should be dealt with. And it ultimately was dealt with by just ignoring them. But I think it's really important to, you know, think about the fact that Sophie was there working with Scotty at that time to, in a sense, you know, preempt land that was within her, we think, territory, right? So yeah, again, it's kind of this, anyways, this way that the colonial archive gestures towards something, but the story of what it's gesturing towards is often not, yeah, not like really told, shared, remembered.
It's often told in a one-sided story. Okay.
That was a really long answer to what is a preemption record. Sorry, guys. So Dory, what were we supposed to talk about next?
That's all right. I was going to jump back in for you. Well, because I know there's a lot of people here. I mean, you know your work intimately. A lot of people, you know, haven't read the dissertation. They don't know the story, and it's more kind of simple, straightforward terms. And so I wonder if you could share what, you know, how you found the names, what was the most significant part of this research journey, and then if you want to, you can turn to the articles that you were hoping to share.
Jess got us a subscription to ancestry.ca, which was a big help, actually. I've never gone there because I didn't want to do it. I wanted to know the stories the way I was supposed to know them, not through any of the, like the ancestry.ca or any of that. I wanted to learn the stories and to carry them the way that Sophie and Emma would have passed on stories before I went there. And I still haven't gone there yet. But by looking at their names and putting some of their names into the search in ancestry.ca, we have younger relatives over around BC here that were looking at connection to, they knew about Sophie or Emma. It was their, you know, 3 times great grandmother. And that's where we started learning about Tlahoholt. The stories of Sophie, you know, that's been passed on to me for as long as I can remember. You know, having people like Alan Stewart come up to me and tell me stories of meeting her, how she didn't speak a lot of English, and Scotty would tap his coffee cup on the table and she'd come out from behind the stove and pour his cup of coffee for him and then go back behind the stove. I guess it was warm there for her. You know, these kind of stories we knew of Sophie, but we didn't know, we had no idea what happened to my grandfather's mother after she left Galliano in what we believe was 1896 in the winter time in a canoe with 4 kids. Yeah. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, so I mean, I think like the story of the research that we did is, on the one hand, there's this intimate, you know, unfolding and reconnection of relationships with Rose and her family. And then on the other, there's also the way that these histories of Indigenous women have continuously been erased by different processes, whether it's a process of colonial, of archiving, or if it's a process of local settler histories written about Scotty that erase Sophie from them, or a process of, you know, the early colonial commissions that also refused to listen to the testimony of Indigenous women. And so I think, what we ended up doing and in the dissertation itself and in the writing of it was really thinking about really carefully what part of this story I could share, and what part of it was kind of mine to share, and which pieces also needed to be left out. So not entered into the dissertation, not entered into that archive in a sense. And yeah, so the dissertation is thinking about these questions of collaboration, but also of refusal, the refusal to, share information, but also this refusal on the part of Rose and her ancestors to forget, this refusal of colonial violence. That has clearly been threaded through 6 generations of women who, even though have been kind of are displaced from territories, are certainly not displaced from connections and stories. And so I think that's kind of the course that the dissertation took, was in thinking through the work of these archives of memory and how that work is a colonial kind of work. And in contrast to that, this very important work of restoring relationalities that Rose and her family continue to do in really beautiful and powerful ways.
Yeah, I was going to say that the last time I was on Galiano, I was fortunate enough to watch Jessica and Rosemary have a bit of a family reunion of sorts through their research, reconnecting with cousins and people they didn't know that Rosemary was related to, and just bringing everybody together back to Galiano to talk about their maternal ancestors that, was responsible for their lives. And it was a really great time of storytelling and sharing. And this kind of goes to a question in the chat. Somebody wasn't quite sure about the relationships, who Sophie and Emma were in terms of the ancestry. If you could maybe talk a little bit about your family story, Rosemary, for who Emma and Sophie were.
Sophie Chardonnat was Scotty Georgeson's wife. We have found out later, or to the best of our knowledge, we believe she was from Cowichan tribes. We weren't sure in the beginning either where or who my great grandmother was, Tlahoholt Emma. And through the connections with family over in the North Shore, we found out where she was from, who her family is, how we're connected over there. There's still so much more to know. One of the things my father always said when I was growing up, you're related to everybody. Just look at it that way. And when you start looking for a partner, you got to go somewhere over the other side of the mountains because you're related to everybody on this side of them. And he was right. Basically, we are. So it was finding out who they were, who Sophie and Emma were. And that's how we started finding the family. Because, like I said, that priest in North Van told me that one of my old aunties, who we knew had a very large family. And you'd think when someone has a family over a dozen kids that some would survive. This priest told me that none of her children survived, none of her grandchildren survived, that there was no one to carry on that family story, and that my grandfather's other 2 siblings had no children and they were gone. So there was no one else. My brothers and I were the only ones left from my grandfather's family, that there was no one else. That was in 1993 when I learned that, and I just kind of, I stopped looking for a while. And when Jess and I started working together, and I can't even remember how it fully came up, Jess. Just that this was something I'd always wanted to know, I'd needed to know. You know, when you grow up like that with not having connections, knowing you have this huge family somewhere and all these connections, but you're not connected to anyone. It just needed to know. It leaves you with that need to know these things. Yeah. Go ahead, Jess.
And then it was just so fun. It was like this amazing whirlwind where like Rose would be sharing a story of her family at a neighborhood house, and then would meet someone that knew one of her relatives, right? And so it then kind of like just in a way snowballed, because the more I think that we learned and shared, the more those connections came through. Yeah, so we do have a photo of this reunion. Do you want to share a little bit more, Rose, about the Homolko connection and the your grandfather's siblings that he was disconnected from, and how you found out where they were? Yeah.
One of the things that my grandfather's brothers and sisters did know is where they were from and who their father was. And when we were going through the archives and looking at birth and death certificates, my grandfather's sisters and brother all had written on their death certificate that they were from Georgeson Bay. Even though their names had been changed, looking for them was hard because their names had been changed from Georgeson to Jorgensen, and one was married, her name became Blaney, but they all knew where they were from Georgeson Bay, or that their father was William Georgeson. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, I can share a couple photos. Rose, do you want to describe kind of what's happening?
This is my cousin Faye, my cousin Darren, Faye's daughter Karina. We're standing around our my great grandfather's, their great grandfather's headstone at the cemetery on Galliano. That's William Georgeson, Billy Georgeson, they called him. That's his headstone. This is the first time that any of my grandfather's siblings had come home, had been there. We were there 2 years prior to that with another cousin and her grandchildren from over in Squamish Nation. There's Lila and her great nephew Norm. But it had been over 120 years since any of William's children that were sent away had come home to Galliano. So that's myself with my cousin Lila and my cousin Norman. My dad, who carried a lot of stories, but because of the times and the way things were, he didn't share a lot. Because as I've found out as years have gone by, that we were actually hidden down in Georgeson Bay to keep us away from residential schools. My father didn't have much like for Catholics, so we were very much hidden down in Georgeson Bay, along with a lot of our other cousins at the south end of Galliano.
Great, thank you. I know that you had wanted to share some of the writing that you've done. Did you want to do that now?
Yeah. Does that make sense, Rose?
Yeah, go ahead, Jess, because the way that we've written is from two different, an academic and a personal view. So go ahead, Jess.
Okay, so this is from an article that we published a number of years ago. I think some of you may have seen it. It was on like Galliano Facebook page. But we thought we would just read a little bit because it really is about also our methodology for working together. Yeah, so I'll start. This is from the introduction. It's one of those West Coast summer days. The sun casts a haze over everything. The tide out near Tsawwassen, British Columbia is low, and the mud flats stretch out so far that you can barely see the salt water. The air is filled with the smell of the ocean when the tide is out. As we drive to the ferry terminal, we pass the soon to open Super Mall. We cross over the remains of the Tsawwassen Nation's longhouse, buried under asphalt and concrete in 1958, when causeway construction began on the ferry terminal. There are no fishing boats on the water, no one out in the tidal flats, just a long stretch of road leading to ferry terminals and container shipping ports. We're heading to Galliano Island, British Columbia. Today marks the culmination of 3 years of working together and a lifetime of research for Rosemary. Rosemary Georgeson is a Sahtu Dene and Coast Salish outreach coordinator in the arts. Earlier in her life, she was a commercial fisherman, truck driver, and chef, and sometimes all these things at the same time. Jessica Hallenbeck is a white, Dutch, Russian, Hungarian settler filmmaker and PhD candidate in geography. This is the first time in 120 years that some of Rosemary's relatives will walk in Georgeson Bay, the birthplace of their ancestral grandmother, Annie, and great-grandmother, Tlahoholt, Emma. This article is about reconnecting Rosemary and her family with their Indigenous grandmothers. It is about how family intersects with water, fish, and territory, revealing the ways that Indigenous women's relationships have transformed and persisted despite generations of erasure. Rose, should I keep going? Yes. Okay, we weave together what we know of the lives of Rosemary's great-great-grandmother, Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh, Sophie, and great-grandmother Tlahoholt, Emma, with stories of water and fish from their territories. In a sense, our research might be thought of as genealogical, connecting places and people over time. We trace the changing relationship between family, water, and fish, asking how settler colonial commissions and urban policy worked to control access to water and how this impacted 5 generations of Rosemary's family. Moving from Rosemary's family to what was happening to fish and water enables us to see the connections between widely disparate events and practices. This approach is critical as there is a need for work that attends to the local, particular, and often violent micro conditions which underpin, produce, and reinforce settler spaces. Yet it is not our desire to fetishize or totalize settler colonial power. We adopt a genealogical approach in order to show how connections to water, fish, and family persist in the face of ongoing occupation. Recentering Indigenous women and their connections raises essential questions about Indigenous resurgence in a context of control, scarcity, and disappearance, emphasizing the importance of ancestral reconnection to Indigenous futurities. We draw on several archives, including the British Columbian Archives, the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, Squamish Archives, and Rosemary's personal archive. We also include conversations and interviews conducted with Rosemary's relatives, descendants of Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh and Tlahoholt, and Rosemary's family on the water. Crucially, this article draws on knowledge that has been passed down to Rosemary and that she has accumulated throughout her lifetime. These stories about where people were from, why they left, and why they never went back, and how they continue to be connected to each other while being disconnected from place, are at the center of this article. To reflect the dialogical nature of our research and in response to critical issues of knowledge ownership, each section of this paper begins with Rosemary's voice, followed by Jessica's voice. Rose, you're up.
Okay. Was it 7 years ago we wrote this, Jess?
Yeah.
Yeah. Come a long way since then. We don't really know who my great-great-grandmother Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh is or where she's from. We know that the government gave her the name Sophie, telling her, like so many Indigenous people, that she needed to have a proper name. On her 1881 marriage certificate, she is listed as Sophie, Indian woman. But we found her real name hidden in the archives, and that is how we know it's Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh. We know much more about her husband, Scotty Georgeson, who made his way to Salish territory from the Shetland Islands in 1858. He left Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh pregnant in Nanu's Bay in 1862 when he went to preempt land and operate the Beaver Pass stopping house in Lightning Creek up in Dakla territory. Scotty came back a few years later, fishing with Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh and operating the Sandheads lightship at the mouth of the Fraser River. Later, they were transferred to the new lighthouse on Main Island at the entrance to Active Pass in the Gulf Islands, then known as Plumper Pass. They lived and worked at the lighthouse on Main Island and built a house on land Scotty preempted in Georgeson Bay on Galliano Island at the opposite end of Active Pass. Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh raised her own kids and most of her grandkids, and even a few of her great-grandchildren at the lighthouse. They did not get married until right after their oldest son, John, married Elizabeth Cornish in 1881. We know from a newspaper article that when Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh and Scotty's youngest son, Henry, died whaling off the coast of Japan, Scotty was consoled in his grief by his many friends and family. But there's no mention of Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh's grief, or even any mention of Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh as Henry's mother. She did not even exist in the death of her son, though she was present at the time raising all her grandchildren. Stories about Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh have been passed down in my family. I know that people would visit Scotty at the big house in Georgeson Bay or at the lighthouse. The people visiting often would not know that Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh was in the room because she always wore black and had a chair behind the old wood stove where she'd sit. When the old Scotsman wanted his coffee refilled, he'd tap his cup on the table and she'd come out and fill his coffee cup. Nobody remembers her speaking, just her movement of coming out from behind the stove. When she wanted to get away, she used to get in her canoe and go out fishing near the lighthouse or in Active Pass. And when she caught a fish that was too big for her to pull on board her canoe, she'd tie her fishing line around her waist and let the fish tow around till it tired itself out. Then she'd row back to the beach and pull the fish in. Uncle Archie talks about Sar-Augh-Ta-Naogh being out on the water longlining with her kids. That was just a normal thing to do. In every photo, she has a dress on. I hope she didn't have it on as those big heavy dresses. I hope they let her wear pants because that's just dangerous. One hook gets caught in that clothing and you go overboard. That clothing would drown you from the weight and wrap itself around you like ropes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I often teach that article in all of my classes, and that's why I get to pull Rosemary and Jessica back in to talk about their research. It's my trick every time. But just such a beautiful, Rosemary, I'm always just struck by how beautiful you tell a story. And I'm just so glad that the collaboration that you and Jessica have done has just pulled out so many stories. I guess this is a good time for me to ask the next set of questions, which is what's next for this project? The dissertation is filed. You've found your answer to your research question. What were their traditional names? And so much more than that. So yeah, I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about what's next.
Go ahead, Jess.
Okay. Well, I'll give like maybe a quick sketch and then Rose can fill in details. Maybe that makes sense. So it's looking like that film that started off our collaboration is going to be distributed by Moving Images, which is really exciting because it means that we'll be able to get it out into the world in an educational context. So I wanted to share that good news. We just heard that this week. Yeah, so Rose and I are working towards a co-authored book that is the dissertation, but obviously with a lot more of Rose's voice in it in a way that's really similar to what we just shared from the article, as well as a digital book that will kind of be able to move in the world in a different way. throughout this work together, we were filming. So there is a ton of material. Every conversation that is quoted was actually filmed. And so it's really exciting to think about bringing these photos and these interviews and these conversations together in a digital format. Yeah, and the other piece I think that's really exciting is that this story is now moving out into the world in a different way and is being kind of held by a number of Indigenous women who all share a connection. Yeah, so Rose, I think, can maybe speak to that a little bit more, but basically it's like for so long it was Rose and I kind of doing this work and holding these stories, and now the next phase of this work is really about, you know, bringing other people into that and having other people bring their stories in and hold these stories and these connections to different places. Oh, and then there's an ongoing collaboration with Ames around a film. So there's so many things. I don't know, I probably forgot something, but Rose, do you want to expand on that a bit?
The collaboration with Ames, that's the third film being created out of the work that Jess and I have been doing together over the years. Yeah, the story, all the research that we've done, it's gotten so large that it's the story is much bigger than just my story, Jess's story. We're sharing with other women from around the Salish Sea in this story now, and connections to it. I've heard from other women across Turtle Island who are looking at ways of finding their family, because this wasn't just done to our family. This was done to many, many families across Turtle Island in the hopes to separate us. So I find that really inspiring that there's other people out there doing the same work now, starting to look and find their families and reconnect them again. Oh, that's awesome, Bonnie. Wave to them all for me. Yeah, it's getting much larger, much more, it's exciting. I don't know what to say about it. I'm just looking so forward to the next few years with this work. Getting to know more of my family, meeting more of us, for more of us to get to know each other. And there's still, you know, I want to go to Scotland. I want to go and learn and understand Scotty one day, and follow up on things that we've heard that we haven't had the chance or the time to look at. Yeah.
And the one thing I totally forgot to mention, which I should have mentioned for sure, is that I'm doing a postdoc with Kate Hennessy at SFU. And as part of that postdoc, we're going to be really kind of going through this archive we've created and digitizing it and thinking about this book project, as well as bringing the story back to Galliano in a couple of different ways. And Rose and I will also be working with the Center for Community Engaged Research at SFU to help kind of guide some of the work that they do in terms of creating resources for academics and researchers who are wanting to do more collaborative work with communities. So we're busy.
Are you still gonna write a play?
You're funny, Dory. That's just some of the things that we're looking at in the, you know, down the road. You know, we have to keep getting through this process right now. And there's so much going on, Jess?
Well, we're really looking forward to it. And that was why I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation, because I've got to hear about it over the years in a very academic, context. And I was like, this is a story that everybody should be so interested in hearing, and especially on Galliano. And so this is a really great part of that, beginning to share it into much wider audiences, what you learn through collaboration, the wonderful stories of these women. And I just know from my own research in Indigenous women's intellectual history, or whatever I'm calling it these days, that is the thing, is uncovering Indigenous women's stories is hard because they are not necessarily collected by institutions over the years. So and it's emotional work as well. I've worked with my own grandmother's residential school archive, and it's not always the happiest of things. So I just salute you both for such a wonderful way of working through a process that ended up being so, I don't know, you held each other up really well. And I wanted to, did you want to talk about In Defiance of all that? Was that part of the same project that?
In Defiance of all that was when we met went up to Campbell River and we met my Hamalko family. And we did a series of interviews with Uncle Bill Blaney, Darren Blaney, Faye Blaney, and just talking about our connections, the work that they do. Darren's fight with fish farming, with Uncle Bill, are stories of connecting again, about old stories. Faye, talking about Faye's work, looking at how our grandmothers were some of the first missing women. They didn't exist, but they were here. They went missing. And looking at that story, bringing that out. So, anything you want to add about that, In Defiance of all that, Jess?
Well, that's like that film is basically the last chapter of the dissertation. And I think, yeah, in some ways it'll be great to be able to screen it on Galliano sometime, because I think there's lots of connections that are made in that film, not just in what people are saying, but also in terms of like what waters and what lands are in that film. And so I think, unlike most people who watch that film, Galliano Islanders, residents, sorry, don't know how to call you guys. Anyways, you'll recognize it, right? You'll recognize it. You'll recognize the boat that's bringing kids to school. You'll recognize Georgeson Bay. So, and that's intentional, right? That those places are in the film, but are not necessarily labeled as such or not described as such. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I guess my concluding question is, I'm thinking about one thing that we've talked a lot about, the family history and Georgeson Bay and the research process. And one of the things that connected all of these things, and Rosemary talked about it a little bit, was water. And just coming kind of full circle to Women and Fish, or We Have Stories, Women and Fish, that film, but just how you think about water as a part of this project, and also the story of your family.
Wow. Water connected us all. That was our movement. That was our way of life. My first memories as a child are from being on the water. That's how we saw our family. We had a different family on the water from our family on land. When we went fishing every year, we'd be on the boats. Dad would be gone most of the time, 8 months out of the year, 6 to 8 months, something like that. And he had a whole other, he didn't have other kids, but you took care of everybody that you fished with. They were like your family. They were your family. So we had other families on the water that moved up and down the coast. We had family all up and down the coast. And water, just those stories, water flows, stories flow. Yeah.
Jess, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what happened was when we really started thinking with water, we were able to find family and understanding how people in Rosemary's family, you know, used water to escape places, used water to connect, used water as livelihood and as, you know, governance, like all of these pieces. And so I think the connection to water and the connection to fish is something that like runs through all of this. But it's not necessarily something that's like, you know, fully articulated, but it remains, I think, the way that people are connected. And so I think, you know, in continuing to hold space for these conversations, like these connections to water are really, you know, what has kept the story over these 6 generations. It's amazing. It's so beautiful.
Thanks, Jess. So I think that was my last question. So I know that I was supposed to hand it back over to the organizers.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm so grateful for your stories, for your analysis, for your conversation. On behalf of the Galliano Library, I want to say how grateful we are for you three to spend your time with us this afternoon. Dory, for your excellent moderation, and Jessica and Rosemary for your amazing collaboration and conversation, and Rosemary for being willing to share the stories of your grandmothers with us this afternoon. Thank you very much. I encourage everyone to give them a round of applause, even if they won't be able to hear it. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. The talk today will be archived on the Galliano Library YouTube page, and we encourage you to share it with your family and friends. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. Just a couple of very anticlimactic announcements. Today's is the last talk in our Spring 2021 speaker series. We hope you've enjoyed all 4 talks, and if you haven't seen the others yet, they are all up on YouTube, as is Rosemary reading her amazing story, A Lifetime with Bulb Kelp, as part of our summer Galliano Writers Reading Series. We welcome your feedback as we plan next year's series, and to send comments or sign up for our mailing list so you won't miss out on any of the events next year, please write to gallianolibrary@gmail.com. The Galliano Library is currently open on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Sundays for socially distant in-person visits from 11 to 2. We strongly encourage you to check out our May book displays, including adult, junior, and early reader titles. This month, the displays highlight writings by Indigenous women, stories, poetry, memoir, and critical analysis, and a couple of plays by one of Rosemary's relatives. Thank you again to our speakers and to everyone for joining us. I did put a copy of the article that Rosemary and Jessica read from in the chat, but if you didn't catch that, please just write to the library and we'd be happy to send it to you. Again,
Kate, could I ask just maybe one quick question? There was one in the chat that I think a lot of people have asked about seeing some of those existing short films, Rose. So I don't know if you or Jess have kind of links to things where those are available already, publicly available, and we can put that on our library Facebook page for folks who want to see what's already out there. So I'll just put that request out to you just so folks can hear it, and we'll follow up with our patrons. Sorry, thanks.
Great. And I have most definitely written down the possibility of a screening of In Defiance, all that sometime very soon. Again, thank you very much. And we wish you all a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dory.
See you later, Dory. Kate.
Bye-bye.
Well-
Thanks.